Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can talk about grandiose and vulnerable narcissism and which one is worse. So I get a lot of these types of questions where there'll be a few disorders and someone might ask which one is worst, or a few personality characteristics, and they'll ask the same thing. And the difficulty is always really the same. You really have to define worse or worst. What's the worst? So I try to look at these questions in this way. Let me look at a particular characteristic of the construct and see if I can see which one is more on one side or the other on a continuum, right? So, for example, with grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, we could say which one is more associated with sadness, right? Because we look at sadness and think, well, sadness is not good. Sadness is not where people want to be. So in a sense, along the sadness continuum, one construct may be worse than the other. Another question I could answer here is, which type offers a greater chance of recovery? And this is an interesting question because the word recovery, with grandiose narcissism, we know there is a pathological variant to that construct, narcissistic personality disorder. With vulnerable narcissism, we know there's not. There is no vulnerable narcissism disorder. There are some disorders which are close, and I'll talk about that, but we don't really have a pathological variant. So then you could ask the question, okay, which type of narcissism would have or offer a greater chance to change? So I'll answer that question as well. So as I talked about, of course, narcissism can be divided into two factors. So I'm going to cover those factors and then talk about the different answers really to these questions. So with narcissism, we have both grandiose narcissism, which is sometimes referred to as overt. And I think it's referred to as overt because it's fairly obvious. When you see somebody who has grandiose narcissistic characteristics, you can usually identify them pretty readily. The characteristics are obvious. The other type of narcissism is vulnerable, and sometimes this is called hypersensitive narcissism, and sometimes it's referred to as covert narcissism. And I think, just like what we see with overt, the reason it's called covert is because it's hard to see. Vulnerable narcissistic characteristics are hidden. They're not as obvious as grandiose. So we see that grandiose and vulnerable narcissism share some characteristics: self-centeredness, a sense of entitlement, a need for admiration. And looking at the five-factor model, I remember it through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We see that both have low agreeableness. Or if you want to think of it a different way, high antagonism, if you're using an alternative way of looking at it. But I like the five-factor model, so low agreeableness. They both share that characteristic. Now, when we move specifically into grandiose narcissism, we see certain characteristics there more so than what we see with vulnerable narcissism, and some characteristics we really only see with grandiose. So there's characteristics like arrogance, being socially bold, having high self-confidence, having superficial charm. Similar to what we see with psychopathy, we also see someone who's resistant to criticism, and this will be important later. We also see callous, unemotional traits, again, similar to psychopathy. Somebody who has grandiose narcissism tends to be optimistic. They tend to be angry and aggressive, but it's externalized. So it's anger and aggression in a traditional sense, and usually as a result of direct confrontation. So it's interesting here because grandiose narcissism, when combined with psychopathy, increases the risk that somebody will commit a crime against a person, whereas vulnerable narcissism mixed with psychopathy increases the chance of a crime against property. So kind of a difference there with the anger and aggression with grandiose versus vulnerable. We also see that grandiose narcissism is associated with being envious, but we usually think of this as like an unconscious envy. So they demonstrate envious behaviors, but they don't know why. We also see fantasies of power, success, and wealth, and these are fairly straightforward. Somebody wants to be a famous business person, a famous politician, an actor, an actress. They want a lot of money. They want people to respect them. So very simplistic fantasies. It's also associated with a high level of extraversion, including positive emotionality. And it's associated with low neuroticism. So again, somebody's kind of calm, and they don't have a lot of anxiety or depression. As I mentioned before, the pathological variant, so if grandiose narcissistic characteristics are taken to the extreme, the disorder would be narcissistic personality disorder. But of course, somebody would have to meet the full criteria for that disorder and be diagnosed by a licensed and qualified clinician. So vulnerable narcissism, of course, is a bit different. Here we see characteristics like being resentful, distrusting other people, similar to what we see with paranoid personality disorder, being insecure, having a lot of shame, and this characteristic is extremely important. I'll come back to it later. Being hypersensitive, being low on extroversion or introverted, being defensive, avoidant, anxious and depressed, socially awkward, shy, being pessimistic as opposed to being optimistic, demonstrating self-absorbed aloofness, having a fragile sense of self or fragile self-esteem. We actually see this with kind of both grandiose and vulnerable, but it's more obvious with vulnerable. We see being cold and distant and being unforgiving. So this makes a lot of sense to me because if somebody has vulnerable narcissism, they can't forgive themselves. So it makes sense that they can't forgive other people. If somebody has grandiose narcissism, there's nothing to forgive. They don't look at themselves as having violated social norms or as having hurt anyone else. So there's a lack of insight there, and therefore they believe they haven't done anything wrong that would require forgiveness. Now, in terms of anger and aggression, I mentioned this with grandiose narcissism, that it's external. With vulnerable narcissism, it's often internal, because somebody with this characteristic doesn't like direct confrontation, but they still have the anger and aggression, and it has to go somewhere. So it's directed inside, it's internal. Now, in terms of jealousy, we saw this with grandiose narcissism. Here, what happens with being envious is that people that have vulnerable narcissism, they feel inferior, so they're aware that they're jealous, and they're aware of why they're jealous. So we see an obliviousness with grandiose narcissism that we don't see here with vulnerable narcissism as far as being jealous. I mentioned before it's associated with low extroversion. It's also associated with high neuroticism. So quite a bit different than grandiose narcissism. Now, in terms of the fantasies, I was talking before about grandiose narcissism and how the fantasies there were like of wealth, power, and success in a very straightforward way. But with vulnerable narcissism, we see fantasies of rejection and redemption. So it's interesting. I've seen a lot of fantasies over the years from people who had grandiose narcissism and fantasies from people who have vulnerable narcissism, and I've talked about these differences in prior videos. But what we see with vulnerable narcissism really is this kind of idea of being rejected by people, being looked down on, being thought of as bad, and then they have a moment of heroism or success that's really poignant, and they're redeemed. See, with grandiose narcissism, there is no rejection component. It's just success. It's just people loving them and appreciating them and throwing money at them and all this. With vulnerable, it's a process. There's a beginning to the fantasy where the person is discarded and thrown away, and they overcome the perceptions of other people, which of course in the fantasy are incorrect. The perceptions are incorrect, and the vulnerable narcissist overcomes this and reaches a point of redemption, where they do get the admiration and the power and the wealth. So I guess both fantasies sort of end up in the same place. But this is pretty interesting, the difference in fantasies, and this will play into kind of how I answer this question about which type of narcissist can change more easily or has a better probability of changing. Now, in terms of pathological variance, I mentioned this a little bit before. Here we see that it has a relationship with certain personality traits and therefore potentially personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, and avoidant personality disorder. But really, vulnerable narcissism, even taken to a pathological extreme, doesn't seem to really align too well with any of these personality disorders. So it's likely that somebody with what would be considered pathological vulnerable narcissism would be diagnosed with one of these personality disorders, but again, it's not a good fit here. We don't see a good fit between any of the 10 personality disorders and vulnerable narcissism. Now, at the subclinical level, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism are considered distinct. Of course, it gets a little more confusing with pathology because there tends to be an oscillation from one type to the other. We see this a little bit with subclinical presentations as well. So whether they're considered distinct or not, or move back and forth between one another, going back to the original questions, which type is more associated with sadness, right? If we're trying to answer the kind of overarching question of which type is worse. Well, it would seem that vulnerable narcissism has a much stronger association with sadness. What about which type offers a greater chance of recovery or a greater chance of change? Well, here I would actually say vulnerable narcissism does, and I'll explain why. We can think about vulnerable narcissism and its relationship to grandiose narcissism in this way. Vulnerable narcissism is a failure of self-enhancement efforts. So vulnerable narcissism is poor self-deception, and grandiose is effective self-deception. I like to think of it with an analogy to Star Trek. I don't know how many have seen the Star Trek movies or the different television series, but the spaceship in Star Trek, the main spaceship, was the Enterprise, and it had shields. And sometimes those shields would be effective and they would deflect attacks, and other times they would go down, they would fail, and the crew of the Enterprise would have to fight off an aggressor in combat in the ship with phasers or sometimes even hand-to-hand. This is really how grandiose and vulnerable narcissism seem to work. In this analogy, grandiose narcissism is the Enterprise with the shields up, so attacks are deflected. The crew might not even know. The attacks come in, they hit the shields, and they could just keep flying through space and not realize it. With vulnerable narcissism, aggressors have boarded the ship. They have to fight in close quarters. They have to face their enemy. So you could look at self-deception kind of like having shields. Great self-deception is equal to effective shields. Grandiose narcissists are resistant to criticism. They don't have to worry about attacks because they can deflect them unconsciously. Vulnerable narcissists don't have this ability. They feel the attacks. They have to fight them off in person, up close and personal. They have to face the nature of the attacker and the attacks themselves. In essence, a vulnerable narcissist is unsuccessful at being a grandiose narcissist. They want to be, often. They want to have that confidence. There's moments where they seem like a grandiose narcissist, but they slip back. They slip back into the vulnerable patterns. And I think it's because of shame. So shame is really the key construct. I mentioned this before when I was talking about vulnerable narcissism. Shame is a feeling that you are bad as opposed to an action being wrong, which of course is guilt. Shame is destructive, but it can lead to change. Now, guilt, I think, does a better job at leading to change, but neither grandiose nor vulnerable narcissism is associated with guilt. So all that we have to work with at a clinical level is shame. But that's not necessarily a terrible thing, because a vulnerable narcissist, through shame, realizes that something is wrong. They often fail to identify what that is, but at least they know there's something going on that's not working. So, in a sense, a vulnerable narcissist has a little bit more insight. Now, to be fair here, both grandiose and vulnerable narcissists are resistant to change. So we have to be realistic in terms of therapy and how much each personality construct will change over time. But if I had to answer the question, which one is more open to change, or which one has a higher probability of changing, which personality construct is more amenable to that, I would say vulnerable narcissism. Now, I know whenever I talk about these constructs of narcissism, there are going to be different opinions. People will agree or disagree with me. Please put your opinions in the comments. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of grandiose and vulnerable narcissism to be interesting. Thanks for watching.